Thank you very much, everyone. So the first thing to say is I'll be reading while presenting. So if anyone is lip reading and can't see my lips, please interrupt me, and I will find a way to contort myself so that you can, using all of the flexibility at my disposal. Please don't expect too much. Okay, so this talk is on strategic orientation in the struggle for disabled people's liberation, and that topic puts me in an awkward position for three reasons. Firstly, because, noble exceptions aside, such matters have been neglected in both the disability studies and social movement literature on our struggle, and also in the action programmes of disabled people's organisations, or DPOs, in recent years. I'm likely then either to sound totally alien to existing debates, or worse, to say at least something completely objectionable to everybody in the room. Secondly, talking about strategy presupposes some equally contentious questions of what outcomes would constitute liberation, the ethical status of certain tactics, theories of human interaction, and so on. And I, like all of you, have my preferred answers to these questions, but justifying them would be a spiel which would test your and the organisers' time. So I'm afraid you're going to have to bear with me on those this morning, and I'm sure we can argue the toss in the bar later. The third reason for discomfort is structurally unavoidable. Strategy requires a theory of change, and a theory of change is inherently an analysis of the present in all its complexity. Much cleverer people than I have found out, to their great embarrassment, how vain such analyses often are. Hello. That's all right. So what I offer here is only a sketch, and one that accepts that there are things about this moment in time that none of us know. Can I have the next slide, please? Cool. So having said all that, I take the current state of disability politics to be a constitutive part of and reaction to what the theorist of democracy Anton Jaeger calls hyperpolitics. And hyperpolitics is, in a nutshell, the return of political contestation and conflict to a society now lacking the social infrastructure in terms of mass parties, trade unions, civic and religious associations to articulate and mediate competing interests. In the absence of, in scare quotes, classical democracies, terrain, sorry, I've just lost myself there. In the absence of classical democracy's terrain, political symbolism is cultivated in the private, subjective sphere, our consumption habits, presentation to others, identitarian and subcultural affiliations, and then interpreted, often somewhat clumsily, into other people's self-presentations, which gives rise to largely aesthetic, superficial, and individualized series of friend-enemy distinctions. Conflicts over race, gender, class, and regional inequalities have returned after the post-political age of neoliberal technocracy, whose slow death I am unwilling to date too precisely, but in a form which is, to paraphrase Jaeger, frenetic yet diffuse, like a neutron bomb which shakes the frame of our world while leaving everything within it intact. Next slide, please. So, in the struggle against disablement, the inputs and outputs of hyperpolitics are clearly legible, even if their relationships are often complex. The number of DPOs of all kinds has declined dramatically over the last decade. For those remaining, both membership numbers and engagement are propitiously down for a variety of reasons. This loss of an organised social base, combined with increasingly aggressive and austere local and central government policies, has incentivised previously mass and autonomous organisations across the developed world to NGOify their operations. Decision-making becomes centralised into small staff teams who negotiate with and receive instructions from the state or other third-party funders and regulators, while lay members are left with little opportunity to influence proceedings. The development of a vicious cycle, characterised by demobilisation, path dependency, and disempowerment, is almost too obvious to miss, but is rarely discussed openly. In light of this decline, there's been a tendency, and perhaps an understandable one, by many disabled activists and scholars to revert to two of the movement's least attractive features to explain and respond to the recent devastation of our living conditions and rights to life. The first of these is conspiratorialism. If the government, whether national here or elsewhere, or transnational governments, are happy enough to send us back into poverty, resegregation, and an early grave, and if civil society allows them to do so, then the obvious explanation reached for is that those in charge secretly want our destruction, or at the very least our prolonged suffering. Examples, many of which are accurate, are found of secret circles of eugenicists in influential positions, corrupt politicians in thrall to anti-welfare business lobbies, bigoted civil servants, and so on. The second response, the legal fetish, intersects with this conspiratorialism, although it is irreducible to it. If our lives are being destroyed by rogue actors, bigots, eugenicists, tyrants of whatever kind, then there ought to be some kind of a law which prevents regressive practices. Where it is recognised, as it always is, that progressive or protective legislation at the national level has failed miserably, then the duty to bring the recalcitrant to heel is pushed higher up the perceived pecking order to supra and international government bodies, and most notably recently the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which is expected to step in and regulate national level practices. These are, of course, strategic dead ends for a social movement. The existence of shadowy forces is no more a guide to action for a liberation struggle than the existence of burglars is to a police force. And reifying their power cultivates similar kinds of paranoias, what Rosa Luxemburg once called the materialism of the Prussian policeman. The turn to international legislation, or more properly legislative inputs, the CRPD is demonstrably not a law, despite how much we talk about it as if it is, has likewise shown itself to be largely futile. Even its most ardent supporters, such as Therese de Guena, temper their heralding of its quote-unquote success from the start with the acknowledgement that most of its signatories neither understand nor wish to implement it, and the UN has no way to make them do either. The much vaunted international opportunities for disabled activists opened by EU ratification of the CRPD are likewise deeply underwhelming, characterised by soft outcomes like networking or skill sharing, while holding DPO representatives several arm's length from actual policymakers. Can I have the next slide, please? There is, however, a compelling alternative orientation within a minority trend of the old disabled people's movement from the 1970s through to 1990s, albeit a disunified one, spanning several competing analyses and groups, and a tendency which was unable to articulate its critique to the dominant strain in the movement at some of the most crucial moments. I should also mention, as Elise brought up Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes quite extensively in the introduction, that this is distinct from them as well and had a very complicated relationship to them, but perhaps we can get into that in the Q&A if you like. I'm calling this orientation anti-politics, not because it rejected all engagement with the legislative or administrative elements of the state, but because it saw them as, firstly, limited in their power to change anything substantial, and secondly, as epistemologically obfuscatory, in that they reduced dynamic processes, reducing dynamic processes of domination and exploitation to essentially administrative and ideological problems. Following a critique of politics first raised by Marx in the 1840s, this orientation viewed legislative and administrative politics as necessitated by the existence of social contradictions, which the state then sought to manage in the interests of a ruling coalition. Insofar as these social contradictions of public and private life, civil harmony and economic violence, abstract freedom and actual domination, anchored the state's existence, without them there could be no state, then the state proves unable either to grasp them in their totality or to resolve them. Insofar as the right to manage rests on the state's unquestioned authority, it is incentivized to ideologically reduce social problems either to its own operations, making everything politics, or alternatively by blaming the things it can't change on laws of human nature or laws of the natural world, which it can be said to have no responsibility over. Some, like Vic Finkelstein, Paul and Judy Hunt, and Dick Lehman in Britain, Martha Russell in the States, and Wilhelm Eckenstein in Sweden, followed Marx in using historical and dialectical materialism to analyse these contradictions and their relationship to the social position disability. Others, like the non-Marxist disabled socialists Michelin Mason, Richard Rieser, and Maggie and Ken Davis, formulated alternative social ontologies to aid their analysis and strategy. What united this camp was their approach to transforming social contradictions at their source, concrete relationships of power and domination between individuals, collective actors, and social structures, which involve inherently messy interactions, self-conceptions, projects, and demands. And they viewed political intervention as a secondary and limited element of social movement projects related to this. In the time remaining, I'll outline 4 planks of this shared strategic legacy. Next slide, please. So the first and foundational insight of this disability anti-politics is that our inferior social position is due to our disempowerment and exclusion from the means of shaping society, whether through control over our own lives, how and where we live, who we associate with, and so forth, or the social leverage which comes with sustained workforce participation and civic engagement. Overcoming this does not require appeals to someone else to sort these problems out for us, which is simply another way of cementing our dependency, but the much more difficult task of bringing disabled people en masse into the fight to seize for ourselves the power to alter society. As the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, or UPIS, put it, our, quote, struggle of necessity requires the active and leading participation of the oppressed group. Others speaking on our behalf, typically the so-called expert or charity spokesperson, can only perpetuate the oppressive social relationship that is disability. Next slide, please. The second plank arises from the first and concerns which organisational form this struggle should take. Agitations around particular disability issues, deinstitutionalisation, benefits payments, access to transport, and segregated workshops predated the disabled people's movement by decades and were largely carried out by mass organisations of disabled people and their allies, or by single-issue campaigning groups of folk with the same or similar impairment. The anti-political trend arose directly from the failures of these agitations at the beginning of the 70s and made two critiques of them. The first, inspired by analysis from the women's movement, was that a focus on singular issues or problems, often driven by spontaneous responses to real misery and injustice, was itself fruitless. If disablement is characterized by systematic disempowerment, then all instances of disability oppression are inherently linked and cannot be meaningfully separated. Disabled militants must be free to confront a multitude of social struggles and to move between them as strategic opportunities emerge or are closed off. The second critique was that such campaigns become inherently undemocratic through their reliance on political manoeuvres and the state. Single-issue campaigns are, almost universally, attempts to make some powerful actor, the state, a business, a charity, whomsoever, alter some aspect of their policy. Organisationally, therefore, they are prone to funnel effects, whereby agitation is carried out by a large number, but only a tiny minority have the function of negotiating settlements with decision makers. In this scenario, there is a tendency for an elite to form within movements and plenty of incentives for it to adopt an insider status at odds with its basest demands, for it also to hoard opportunities and skills, and to demobilise or underdevelop the creative potential of the wider movement. In opposition to this tendency, models of disabled people's organisation were developed to promote genuinely self-directed activity, with participative democratic structures inbuilt to them. These veered from democratic centralist organisations based on the Leninist party model, like UPIS, to horizontal and decentralised networks, like the Liberation Network of People with Disabilities and the Direct Action Network, alongside democratic models of service delivery, like housing co-ops and centres for integrated living. These organisational forms shared two core innovations. Firstly, they did not seek in the first instance to redirect existing power, compelling or persuading it to change its course, but to seize it for themselves. These new movement organisations were designed to secure and administer disabled people's control over their housing options, personal support and equipment provision, educational employment opportunities, and so forth. In short, their project was a democratisation of life beneath political structures, at the level where power and domination are operationalised, rather than where they are rationalised and mediated post festum. Secondly, they, in distinction from expert-led lobbying groups, organise themselves as collective knowledge producers, insisting on shared strategic reflection, skill development, and theoretical innovation through their democratic structures, campaign reportings, internal publications, and conferences. This served a dual purpose. Firstly, to break the division of labour between intellectuals, militants, and bureaucrats within the social movement, therefore increasing its resilience. And secondly, to arrest the development of movement elites who could enforce and maintain personal dominance over strategy and be prone to conciliation with a disabling world. Next slide, please. The third plank is an orientation towards creating conflict with and between the array of forces which enforce our exclusion from society, and which, in their organised forms of parastate bodies, firms, charities, and so forth, monopolise the real politics of disability. Conflicts not only took the form of frontal assaults on agents of oppression, pickets, direct actions, and campaigns of non-compliance against those who most obviously police our disempowerment, but calculated disruptions of the uneasy alliances between different oppressive social agents. Where practical disagreements existed between welfare departments, charities, professional bodies, etc., these contradictions were pushed and magnified from the outside to engender, wherever possible, a breakdown of the status quo ante, which allows the movement to exercise power more efficiently over social relations. In particular, attention was focused on those workers in the disability industry dissatisfied with the banality, misery, and cruelty of their jobs, who could be peeled off from their managers, employers, and where necessary, trade unions, and offered a meaningful role in furthering the struggle for self-determination. Next slide, please. Bring on the... Oh, perfect. So, the final plank, probably the most contentious and sadly the most under-theorised, is a critical re-engagement with politics itself. Following Marx, activists like Paul Hunt, Maggie Davis, and Martha Russell recognise politics as an alienated social relationship which obscures the true workings of human power, but crucially, one retaining a limited and obscured social efficacy in dangerous contradiction with emerging social movements. The challenge then was to engage this power to mediate the damage it could do to movement development without falling prey to its fetish character or reduction of social contradictions to itself. The debate on exactly what this means was muted, with critiques of competing tactics rarely rising above the somewhat catty asides in movement literature. But some general principles were shared. In what the philosopher Isabel Garro has recently theorized as the quote, reconquest of politics, the central push of this tendency was to force political power to recognize and respond to the emergent movement in ways that opened up its strategic flexibility and practical power, rather than securing for movement organizations a permanent presence within political structures. To achieve this, interventions into politics must be limited in scope and scale and be conducted from outside the political arena. In cash value, this means exerting pressure to remove legal and other barriers to the movement's expansion and self-organized responses to the problems its members face, rather than demanding a political solution to these problems in themselves. The movement's ability to resolve social contradictions itself through its own institutions taking control of community infrastructure are based on its local activities and cultivation of social power. The intervention into politics must never be allowed to steal energy from these tasks, which itself is simply a form of demobilization, nor entail exclusive alliances with any one political party, whose programme and election strategies the movement then becomes dependent upon. Just as a weird side, that's a big question and a big problem in two-party democracies like Britain. There's probably a little bit more room for manoeuvre in PR systems like the Netherlands, but I think the principle still stands. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I will leave it there, and I just want to say thanks so much for your attention and really looking forward to the discussion.